Have you ever felt that something profound was missing from the story you were told about Jesus? Not a detail, not a footnote, but something fundamental, something that could change everything you thought you knew about Christianity's origins. For nearly 2,000 years, one question has been whispered in the shadows of history, debated in closed academic circles, and carefully avoided by institutional authorities. It's a question so potentially transformative that many have argued it should never be asked out loud. And yet, here we are, about to ask it. What if Jesus had a family? Not the family we know from Scripture, not Mary, Joseph, and the extended relatives mentioned in passing. I'm talking about his own family, a wife, perhaps children, a lineage that extended beyond the cross, beyond the resurrection narratives, beyond the carefully constructed theological frameworks that have defined Western civilization for centuries. Your immediate reaction to this question reveals something important about you. Perhaps you feel defensive, perhaps curious, perhaps you've always suspected there was more to the story. Whatever you're feeling right now, stay with me. Because what you're about to discover isn't speculation designed to undermine faith. It's historical investigation designed to understand truth. The narrative we've inherited is powerful and beautiful. The celibate savior, the pure, untouched divine messenger, the God-man who transcended earthly attachments to bring salvation to humanity. It's a story that has inspired billions, created magnificent art, shaped moral philosophy, and provided comfort in humanity's darkest hours. But what if parts of that narrative were constructed, not by Jesus himself, but by the councils and institutions that came afterward? What if the historical Jesus, the actual man who walked the dusty roads of Galilee, who laughed with friends and wept with the grieving, lived a life that included the most human experience of all, intimate love and family? This isn't a new question. It's been asked by historians, theologians, and researchers for centuries. Some have been silenced. Some have been ridiculed. Some have had their academic careers destroyed for daring to investigate this possibility seriously. The question itself has been labeled heretical, blasphemous, dangerous. But here's what's interesting. The more aggressively a question is suppressed, the more important it usually is. Throughout this exploration, we're going to examine actual historical evidence, not fantasy, not conspiracy theory, not sensationalism. We're going to look at manuscripts that survived centuries of suppression, archaeological discoveries that challenge official narratives, and historical contexts that paint a very different picture of early Christianity than most people realize. We're going to talk about Mary Magdalene, not as the repentant prostitute of later tradition, but as the historical figure revealed in both canonical and non-canonical texts. We're going to examine what marriage meant in first-century Jewish culture, and why an unmarried rabbi in his 30s would have been almost unthinkable in that context. We're going to explore the Council of Nicaea and other pivotal moments when Christianity's narrative was shaped by political power as much as spiritual revelation. We're going to follow trails of tradition that wound through medieval France, preserved by communities that maintained oral histories across generations. And we're going to ask the hardest question of all. Why? If there is truth to these alternative narratives, why were they suppressed? What was at stake? What would it mean for institutional authority if Jesus had lived a fully human life, including the intimate partnerships that make us most human? Before we begin, let me be clear about something crucial. This investigation doesn't require you to abandon your faith. Many deeply devout believers have explored these questions and found their spirituality deepened, not diminished. Understanding the historical context of Jesus doesn't erase the power of his teachings. It doesn't invalidate the transformative experiences millions have had through Christian practice. If anything, seeing Jesus as fully human, as someone who might have known romantic love, who might have held his own children, who might have experienced the full spectrum of human attachment, can make his sacrifice, his compassion, and his teachings even more profound. It means he spoke about love from experience, not just divine abstraction. So I'm not asking you to believe anything today. I'm asking you to question, to investigate, to consider possibilities that have been kept from mainstream conversation for reasons we'll explore together. The truth has a remarkable quality. It survives. Even when texts are burned, when manuscripts are hidden, when oral traditions are persecuted, truth finds a way to persist. It lives in fragments of papyrus discovered in Egyptian caves, It survives in the rituals of marginalized communities. It echoes in the contradictions and silences of official narratives. What you're about to hear isn't the final word. It's an invitation to a conversation that has been suppressed for too long. A conversation about history, about power, about the very human tendency to shape narratives to serve institutional interests. Are you ready to explore what lies beneath 2 millennia of carefully constructed narrative? Are you prepared to ask the forbidden question and follow the evidence wherever it leads? Then let's begin this journey together. Not as adversaries of faith, but as seekers of truth. Not to destroy, but to understand. Not to diminish the sacred, but to discover what might have been hidden within it all along. To understand what might have been hidden about Jesus' personal life, we first need to understand something most people never learn. Early Christianity was nothing like the unified, doctrinally consistent religion we know today. For the first 3 centuries after Jesus' death, Christianity was a wild garden of competing beliefs, practices, and interpretations. Imagine a world where there was no single Bible, no pope, no official doctrine. Instead, dozens of communities scattered across the Roman Empire, each preserving different memories of Jesus, each emphasizing different aspects of his teaching, each claiming to possess the authentic tradition. Some communities believed Jesus was fully divine, with only the appearance of humanity. Others insisted he was a human prophet chosen by God. Some practiced baptism for the dead. Others rejected physical resurrection entirely, teaching instead that Jesus offered knowledge, gnosis, that could free the soul from material existence. In Alexandria, Egypt, Christian theologians blended Jesus' teachings with Platonic philosophy. In Syria, communities preserved sayings of Jesus in Aramaic that never made it into the Greek Gospels. In Rome, different Christian groups competed for legitimacy, each claiming apostolic authority. This wasn't chaos, it was diversity. It was what happens when a revolutionary teacher's message spreads organically, interpreted through different cultural lenses, preserved by different communities with different needs and understandings. Now here's what's crucial for our investigation. In this diverse early Christianity, many communities preserved traditions about Jesus that later became unacceptable to institutional orthodoxy. Some of these traditions concerned his relationship with Mary Magdalene. Some spoke of secret teachings passed down through specific lineages. Some suggested Jesus' message was about personal spiritual transformation rather than ecclesiastical authority. Let's ground ourselves in the historical context of first-century Judea, because this matters enormously for understanding Jesus as a historical figure. Jewish religious teachers, rabbis, were expected to marry. In fact, rabbinic literature from the period suggests that remaining unmarried was considered almost a violation of divine commandment. The Torah's first instruction is, "Be fruitful and multiply." A teacher who didn't marry would have been viewed with suspicion, seen as failing to fulfill basic religious obligations. We know from historical records that other prominent Jewish teachers of the era were married. We know that marriage was the norm, not the exception. We know that celibacy was extremely rare, practiced by some Essene communities, but generally considered an aberration rather than an ideal. So here's the question historical scholars have wrestled with. Why would we assume Jesus was the exception? What evidence do we have for his celibacy beyond later theological constructions that required him to be celibate to fit certain doctrinal frameworks? The answer, honestly, is that we don't have strong evidence for his celibacy in the earliest sources. The silence in the canonical Gospels about Jesus' marital status might not indicate celibacy. It might simply reflect that marriage was so assumed, so normal, that it didn't require mention. Think about modern biographies. If you read a historical account of a prominent figure, the author doesn't constantly remind you, "and he was married," or "and he had a wife." It's assumed context unless there's something unusual about it. Archaeological discoveries over the past century have given us fascinating windows into this early Christian diversity. In 1945, an Egyptian farmer digging near the town of Nag Hammadi discovered a sealed jar containing 13 leather-bound papyrus books. These texts, dating from the 3rd and 4th centuries but likely preserving earlier traditions, revealed a Christianity that official history had erased. Among these texts were Gospels attributed to Thomas, Philip, and Mary Magdalene herself. These weren't forgeries or later fabrications, they were genuine expressions of early Christian belief, preserved by communities that were eventually branded heretical and suppressed. What's striking about many of these texts is their different portrayal of relationships within Jesus' inner circle. They present a more egalitarian vision, where women played crucial teaching and leadership roles. They preserve traditions that make modern readers uncomfortable, precisely because they humanize Jesus in ways that later theology couldn't accommodate. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered beginning in 1947, gave us another crucial piece of context. These texts, preserved by a Jewish community near the Dead Sea, showed us the religious world in which Jesus lived. They revealed messianic expectations, ritual practices, and theological debates that were happening in Jesus' immediate environment. Some scholars have noted interesting parallels between Jesus' teachings and those of the Qumran community, though there are also significant differences. What the scrolls definitively show is that first-century Judaism was far more diverse than later traditions suggested, with multiple competing visions of what faithfulness to God required. Here's what this historical context means for our investigation. When we ask whether Jesus had a family, we're not proposing something wild or unprecedented. We're asking whether the historical Jesus participated in the normal social practices of his time and culture, whether the celibate Jesus of later theology reflects historical reality or theological construction. Academic research over the past several decades has increasingly recognized that the unified, doctrinally consistent Christianity we think of as normative was actually the product of complex historical processes. It emerged from political decisions, theological debates, and institutional power struggles that took centuries to resolve. The Jesus of history, as opposed to the Christ of theology, lived in a specific time and place, participated in a specific culture, and most likely followed the normal social conventions of that culture. Understanding this doesn't diminish his spiritual significance. If anything, it makes his teachings about love, compassion, and justice more profound, because he spoke from lived experience rather than divine detachment. If you're finding this perspective eye-opening, if you're realizing that Christianity's origins are more complex and fascinating than you were taught, then you're ready for this journey. This isn't about destroying faith. It's about understanding the human story behind the theological constructions. Subscribe to this channel and join a community that's willing to ask difficult questions, to investigate suppressed histories, and to seek truth, even when it challenges comfortable narratives. We're exploring what institutions tried to erase, and your voice is part of this rediscovery. Hit that subscribe button, because this journey is just beginning. Now let's examine what the actual texts tell us. Not speculation, not later tradition, but what the preserved manuscripts, both canonical and non-canonical, actually say about Jesus' relationships, particularly with women. In the canonical Gospels, women play far more prominent roles than most people realize. They're the primary witnesses to the resurrection, the most important event in Christian theology. In a patriarchal society where women's testimony wasn't considered legally valid, this is remarkable. The Gospel writers preserved this tradition even though it was potentially embarrassing from a cultural credibility standpoint. Mary Magdalene appears in all 4 canonical Gospels. She's consistently portrayed as devoted to Jesus, present at the crucifixion when most male disciples had fled, and the first to encounter the risen Christ. The Gospel of John presents an intimate scene where the resurrected Jesus speaks her name, Mary, and she responds, Rabboni, an especially affectionate form of teacher. Why would she be given this privileged position as first witness? Some scholars suggest it indicates she held special status among Jesus' followers. Others note that the early church struggled with this, trying to explain why women, and Mary Magdalene specifically, held such prominent positions in the resurrection narratives. The Gospel of Luke mentions that several women traveled with Jesus and the 12 disciples, providing for them out of their own resources. This indicates women weren't just passive followers, they were financial supporters and active participants in Jesus' ministry. Among these women, Mary Magdalene is named first, suggesting preeminence. But it's in the non-canonical texts where things get really interesting. The Gospel of Philip, preserved in the Nag Hammadi library, contains a damaged passage that has sparked enormous scholarly debate. The text, with gaps where the papyrus has deteriorated, reads something like, "The companion of the Savior, is Mary Magdalene. He loved her more than all the disciples and used to kiss her, often on her. The crucial word here is companion. In the Coptic text, it's koinonos, which can mean companion, partner, or even consort. The word carries connotations of intimate partnership. Now, the text is damaged, so we need to be cautious about interpretation. But what's preserved is certainly suggestive of a special relationship. The Gospel of Mary, another non-canonical text, portrays Mary Magdalene as a recipient of secret teachings from Jesus. When she shares these teachings with the male disciples, Peter responds with hostility. Did he really speak with a woman in private without our knowledge? Should we all turn and listen to her? Did he prefer her to us? Levi defends her, responding, surely the Savior knows her very well. That is why he loved her more than us. What's significant here isn't just the suggestion of a special relationship, but the controversy it generated. These texts preserve conflicts within early Christian communities about Mary Magdalene's status. Why would there be conflict if she was merely one follower among many? Some ancient texts describe tension between Peter and Mary Magdalene, with Peter representing emerging institutional authority and Mary representing alternative spiritual authority, possibly based on intimate knowledge of Jesus' teachings. The Gospel of Thomas, a collection of 114 sayings attributed to Jesus, ends with a controversial exchange. Simon Peter says, "Let Mary leave us, for women are not worthy of life." Jesus responds, "I myself shall lead her in order to make her male, so that she too may become a living spirit resembling you males. For every woman who will make herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven." This saying is deeply troubling to modern sensibilities, but scholars suggest it reflects first-century debates about gender, spiritual transformation, and authority within Christian communities. The saying may be preserving conflict over whether women could be legitimate teachers and leaders. What all these texts, canonical and non-canonical, consistently show is that Mary Magdalene held a special, controversial, and prominent position in the earliest Christian communities. The nature of that position has been debated, suppressed, and reinterpreted for 2 millennia. Later, church tradition transformed Mary Magdalene into a repentant prostitute, a characterization found nowhere in the earliest sources. Pope Gregory I, in 591 CE, conflated Mary Magdalene with other women in the Gospels, including an unnamed sinful woman who anoints Jesus' feet. This conflation stuck for over 1,000 years. Why? Some historians suggest this reframing served to diminish Mary Magdalene's status as a teacher and leader. If she could be portrayed as a saved sinner rather than a primary disciple, her authority could be minimized. The Church could point to her as an example of redemption, while denying her the apostolic authority suggested by earlier traditions. The Catholic Church officially separated Mary Magdalene from the sinful woman only in 1969, nearly 1,400 years after Gregory's conflation. In 2016, Pope Francis elevated her feast day to match those of the Apostles, officially recognizing her as Apostle to the Apostles. This modern recognition acknowledges something early texts had always suggested. What we see in these texts is complexity. We see a woman who was clearly central to Jesus' ministry and to the earliest Christian communities. We see controversy and conflict over her status. We see traditions that suggest intimacy and special knowledge, and we see centuries of reinterpretation and suppression. The texts don't give us definitive proof of marriage or family, but they give us something perhaps more important: context. They show us that early Christianity preserved memories of women as leaders, teachers, and intimate companions of Jesus, memories that later became inconvenient for institutional authorities. Let's focus specifically on Mary Magdalene, because she's absolutely central to understanding what might have been hidden about Jesus' personal life. Who was this woman who appears at the most crucial moments in the gospel narratives, yet whose true role has been obscured by centuries of misrepresentation? First, let's clear away what we know is false. Mary Magdalene was not a prostitute. There is no evidence in any early Christian source that she was a sex worker, a woman of loose morals, or anyone with a particularly sinful past. That characterization is entirely a later construction, and recognizing it as such is crucial. The identification of Mary Magdalene with the sinful woman who anoints Jesus appears nowhere in the earliest Christian writings. It's a conflation that served political and theological purposes, diminishing a powerful woman's status by reimagining her as a reformed sinner whose primary value lay in her repentance rather than her teaching or leadership. So who was she really? Mary Magdalene was from Magdala, a prosperous fishing town on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee. Archaeological excavations have revealed Magdala was a significant economic center in the 1st century, with evidence of wealth and commerce. This matters because it suggests Mary Magdalene likely came from a family of means, which would explain how she could be among the women who provided for Jesus and the disciples out of their own resources. The canonical Gospels tell us that Jesus had cast 7 demons out of Mary Magdalene. Modern scholars debate what this means: literal demon possession, mental illness, or perhaps something metaphorical related to spiritual transformation. Whatever it means, the detail indicates she had a dramatic encounter with Jesus that changed her life fundamentally. What's absolutely clear is her prominence. She's named more often in the Gospels than most of the 12 disciples. She's present at the crucifixion when most male followers had fled. She's the first witness to the resurrection, the foundational event of Christianity, and in several non-canonical texts, she's portrayed as a recipient of special teachings and a source of conflict with male disciples, particularly Peter. Let's consider what being first witness to the resurrection actually meant in the cultural context. In 1st century Jewish society, women's testimony was not considered legally valid. The Gospel writers could have easily made Peter or John the first witness. It would have been more culturally credible. Yet all 4 Gospels preserve the tradition that Mary Magdalene encountered the risen Christ first. This is what historians call the criterion of embarrassment, details that early communities would have been unlikely to invent because they were culturally problematic. The fact that this tradition persisted despite being embarrassing suggests it reflected actual historical memory. The Gospel of John presents the most intimate resurrection encounter. Jesus appears to Mary Magdalene in the garden, and when she doesn't recognize him, he simply speaks her name, Mary. She responds Rabboni, a deeply personal, affectionate form of teacher. The scene is tender, intimate, personal in ways that suggest profound connection. Jesus then says something that has puzzled interpreters for centuries. "Don't cling to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father." Some translations render this, "do not touch me." The Greek word used is hapto, which means to touch, to cling to hold. The instruction suggests she was reaching for him, wanting to embrace him, and he was gently restraining her. Why this instruction? Scholars have proposed numerous interpretations, but the emotional texture of the scene is undeniable. This is not a distant teacher addressing a casual follower. This is an intimate exchange between 2 people with deep emotional connection. In the non-canonical texts, Mary Magdalene's role becomes even more pronounced. The Gospel of Mary portrays her as teaching the other disciples, sharing secret revelations Jesus had given her. Peter responds with jealousy and sexism. Did he really speak with a woman in private? Levi defends her, saying Jesus loved her more than the other disciples. This tension between Peter, representing institutional authority, and Mary Magdalene, representing alternative spiritual authority, appears in multiple texts. Some scholars see this as reflecting actual historical conflicts in early Christianity, between communities that accepted women's spiritual authority and those that sought to restrict leadership to men. The Pistis Sophia, a Gnostic text from the 3rd or 4th century, portrays Mary Magdalene as Jesus' most insightful disciple, the one who asks the deepest questions and receives the most profound teachings. In this text, she's called the pure spiritual woman, and the one whose heart is more directed toward the kingdom than all her brothers. Archaeological discoveries have complicated the picture further. In 1896, a papyrus fragment was published containing part of the Gospel of Mary, previously unknown. In 1945, the more complete Nag Hammadi texts revealed the full scope of texts portraying Mary Magdalene as a central spiritual figure. Traditions preserved in medieval France tell of Mary Magdalene fleeing Jerusalem after the crucifixion, traveling by boat to what is now southern France, and living there for decades. Some traditions say she brought Jesus' child with her. Some say she was pregnant when she fled. Some say she carried sacred knowledge that needed to be preserved. We'll explore these French traditions more deeply later, but what's significant now is recognizing that multiple independent traditions, in texts, in oral history, in ritual practice, preserve memories of Mary Magdalene as far more than a minor follower. She emerges as a teacher, a leader, possibly a partner, and certainly someone whose full story has been systematically obscured. Why obscure her? The answer connects to power, authority, and control, themes we'll explore deeply. But for now, recognize this. Mary Magdalene's prominence in early Christianity is undeniable. What that prominence meant, what role she actually played, what relationship she had with Jesus, these questions have been suppressed, but they won't disappear. What do you think? Why was the role of women in early Christianity minimized over the centuries? If communities like those behind the Gospel of Mary and Gospel of Philip preserved traditions of female spiritual authority, what does it mean that those traditions were eventually branded heretical and suppressed? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective is part of recovering these lost voices. To understand how certain stories about Jesus survived while others disappeared, we need to examine the pivotal moments when Christianity transformed from a diverse collection of communities into an institutionalized religion with orthodox doctrine and heretical alternatives. The most famous of these moments is the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, convened by the Roman Emperor Constantine. But we need to be precise about what actually happened there, because popular imagination has created myths about this council that exceed historical reality. The Council of Nicaea did not, contrary to popular belief, vote on which books would be included in the Bible. That's a common misconception, but the canon of Scripture was actually determined through a longer, more complex process extending over several centuries. Different regions and communities recognized different texts as authoritative well into the 4th and 5th centuries. What Nicaea did do was attempt to resolve a major theological controversy about the nature of Christ, specifically the Arian controversy about whether Jesus was of the same divine substance as God the Father or a created being subordinate to the Father. The Council, under Constantine's political pressure, affirmed what became orthodox doctrine, that Christ was of one substance with the Father. But here's what's crucial. Constantine wasn't primarily concerned with theological precision. He wanted unity. The Roman Empire was fracturing, and Constantine saw Christianity as a potential unifying force, but only if Christians could agree on basic doctrine. Religious diversity was politically inconvenient for an emperor trying to hold an empire together, so theological decisions at Nicaea and subsequent councils were inextricably tied to political power. This doesn't make them automatically wrong, but it means we must recognize that institutional Christianity's defining moments involved political calculation as much as spiritual discernment. The process of canonization, determining which books would be included in the Christian Bible, happened more gradually. Some texts were universally accepted early on. The 4 Gospels we know, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were recognized as authoritative by most communities by the end of the 2nd century, though not universally. Other texts remained controversial for much longer. The Epistle to the Hebrews, the Book of Revelation, and several other New Testament books were disputed by various communities into the 4th century. Meanwhile, texts like the Shepherd of Hermas, the Epistle of Barnabas, and the Didache were considered scripture by some communities but ultimately excluded. The criteria for inclusion varied, but generally included apostolic origin attributed to an apostle or close associate, widespread usage in multiple Christian communities, consistency with emerging Orthodox teaching, and liturgical utility. But these criteria were applied inconsistently, and politics often influenced decisions. Many texts were excluded, not because they were obviously fraudulent or late, but because they represented theological perspectives that emerging orthodoxy found problematic. The Gospel of Thomas, for instance, dates to the 2nd century and may preserve some authentic sayings of Jesus, but its theological perspective, emphasizing secret knowledge and individual spiritual transformation rather than institutional authority and physical resurrection, made it unacceptable to emerging orthodoxy. The Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Philip, the Pistis Sophia, and dozens of other texts were branded as heretical and their communities persecuted, not because these texts were historically worthless, but because they represented Christianities the institutional church couldn't accommodate. In 367 CE, Bishop Athanasius of Alexandria issued an Easter letter listing exactly 27 books as the New Testament, the same 27 we have today. He explicitly condemned the reading of non-canonical texts. This letter represents an important moment in the hardening of canon boundaries, though different regions continued to debate the exact contents of Scripture for decades longer. Theodosius I, Roman emperor from 379 to 395 CE, made Nicene Christianity the official state religion of the Roman Empire in 380 CE. Alternative forms of Christianity were now not just theologically incorrect, they were legally prohibited. Texts representing non-orthodox perspectives were ordered destroyed. Communities preserving alternative traditions faced persecution. This is how most of the non-canonical texts disappeared, not through reasoned theological debate, but through imperial decree backed by force. Texts were burned, communities were scattered, teachers were silenced or killed. But here's what's remarkable: texts survived anyway. People hid manuscripts in jars and buried them in the Egyptian desert. Communities preserved oral traditions across generations despite persecution. The truth had a stubborn persistence. When we ask, why don't we know about Jesus' possible family? Part of the answer lies here. If there were early Christian traditions about Jesus having a wife and children, they would have been preserved primarily in texts and communities that emphasized his humanity, his full participation in human life. These are exactly the texts and communities that institutional Christianity branded heretical and tried to erase. The councils didn't just decide theological questions, they decided what could be remembered and what must be forgotten. They shaped not just doctrine but history itself. Now we travel to southern France, to the small town of Sainte-Marie-de-la-Mer on the Mediterranean coast, where for over 1,000 years a remarkable tradition has been preserved. It's a tradition that connects directly to our central question about Jesus' family. Every May, tens of thousands of Romani people, often called gypsies, though that term can be considered offensive, pilgrimage to this small coastal town to honor a figure named Sara la Kali, Sara the Black. According to tradition preserved across generations, Sara was the daughter of Jesus and Mary Magdalene, who fled to France after the crucifixion. Let me be absolutely clear. I cannot prove this tradition is historically accurate. Oral traditions are notoriously difficult to verify, especially when they've been preserved by marginalized communities who had every reason to keep their beliefs hidden from authorities that might persecute them. But what we can say is that this tradition is ancient, persistent, and deeply significant to the communities that have maintained it. The legend, as preserved in southern France, tells of a boat arriving on the coast carrying several women: Mary Magdalene, Mary Salome, Mary Jacobi, mother of James, and a dark-skinned woman or girl named Sara. Some versions say Sara was a servant or companion. Other versions say she was Mary Magdalene's daughter, the child of Jesus. The town of Sainte-Marie-de-la-Mer literally means Saint Mary's of the Sea, named for this legendary arrival. In the church crypt, there's a statue of Sara la Kali, worn smooth by centuries of devotees touching her in prayer and devotion. The statue depicts a dark-skinned woman, and she's venerated particularly by Romani communities who consider her their patron saint. The annual pilgrimage is a remarkable sight. Thousands gather, many having traveled vast distances, to honor Sara. They carry her statue from the church to the sea, wading into the water in commemoration of her arrival. It's a ritual that predates written records, preserved through oral tradition and embodied practice. Historical records of this tradition are sparse before the medieval period, which makes sense given that marginalized communities rarely had their beliefs documented by literate authorities, but references to the tradition appear in texts by the 9th century, and the pilgrimage itself was well established by the time we have reliable documentation. Some scholars have suggested the tradition might represent a Christianization of earlier goddess worship, that Sara la Kali might connect to ancient Mediterranean mother goddess cults that were gradually absorbed into Christian practice. The name Kali has led some to speculate about connections to the Hindu goddess, though this seems linguistically unlikely. More probably, Kali derives from a Romani word meaning black or dark. Other scholars take the tradition more literally as a preserved memory of actual historical events. They point to several intriguing details. Why would communities preserve a tradition about Jesus' daughter unless there was some historical basis? Why specifically connect Mary Magdalene to southern France? Why would this tradition be maintained across centuries despite no official church recognition? Medieval legends elaborate the tradition further. According to some accounts, Mary Magdalene lived for 3 decades in a cave in the Saint-Baume Massif, not far from the coast. She was a contemplative, a teacher, a preserver of sacred knowledge. When she died, her body was said to have been buried at the site that became the Basilica of Saint Maxima. In 1279, Charles II of Anjou announced the discovery of Mary Magdalene's bones at Saint Maxima. Whether these were actually her remains is impossible to verify, but the claim sparked renewed devotion and made the site a major pilgrimage destination. The Catholic Church officially recognizes the relics, though with the understanding that such identifications from that era are not historically reliable. What's particularly interesting is how persistent the Magdalene traditions are in southern France specifically. Multiple sites claim connections to her, multiple legends place her there. This concentration of traditions in one geographic region suggests something was being remembered and preserved, even if we can't definitively verify what that something was. The Cathars, a religious movement that flourished in southern France in the 12th and 13th centuries before being violently suppressed by the Catholic Church, reportedly venerated Mary Magdalene and preserved traditions about her special relationship with Jesus. Cathar beliefs included rejection of the Catholic Church's institutional authority and emphasis on direct spiritual knowledge, beliefs that resonated with those earlier Gnostic communities that had also preserved traditions of Mary Magdalene as a teacher. When the Cathars were massacred during the Albigensian Crusade, many of their specific teachings died with them. But they existed in the same region where Sara Lakali traditions were preserved, suggesting a possible connection between different communities maintaining alternative memories of Christian origins. The Knights Templar, a medieval military order that operated extensively in southern France, were also rumored to have secret knowledge about Jesus and Mary Magdalene. When the Templars were suppressed in the early 14th century, their leaders tortured and executed. Numerous legends emerged about hidden treasures and secret documents. Some of these legends connected to Mary Magdalene and to sacred bloodlines. Separating fact from legend in all these interconnected traditions is extremely difficult. But what we can say with confidence is this: southern France preserved consistent, persistent traditions over many centuries, that Mary Magdalene fled there after the crucifixion, that she lived there for decades, and that she brought something, whether knowledge, sacred objects, or a child, that needed to be protected. These traditions were maintained by marginalized communities, Romani people, religious dissidents, esoteric groups. They were never officially recognized by the Church, yet they persisted. They were passed down through stories, rituals, pilgrimages, and devotion when written records would have been dangerous. The question we must ask is, why? Why would these specific traditions persist in this specific place if there was no historical kernel at their center? Archaeological evidence is simultaneously tantalizing and frustrating when we investigate Jesus' possible family. The physical evidence that exists raises fascinating questions, but provides few definitive answers. Let's examine what we actually have and what it might tell us. In 1980, during construction work in Jerusalem's Talpiot neighborhood, workers discovered an ancient tomb containing 10 ossuaries, stone boxes used for reburying bones after the flesh had decomposed, a common Jewish burial practice in the 1st century. The inscriptions on these ossuaries included names that struck archaeologists immediately: Jesus, son of Joseph, Maria, Mariamene, Judah, son of Jesus, and Matthew. Could this be Jesus' family tomb? The discovery sparked enormous controversy. Some researchers argued that the statistical probability of finding this particular cluster of names together was extraordinarily low, suggesting this might indeed be Jesus of Nazareth's family burial site. The name Mariamene was particularly interesting. Some scholars identified this as a diminutive form of Mary, specifically associated with Mary Magdalene in certain texts. The ossuary inscribed Judah, son of Jesus, was perhaps most provocative. If this tomb contained Jesus of Nazareth's remains, this inscription might indicate he had a son, exactly what we've been investigating. However, most scholars remain deeply skeptical of the Talpiot tomb identification. The names found there, Jesus, Joseph, Mary, Matthew, Judah, were extremely common in first-century Jerusalem. Statistical analyses have produced widely varying conclusions depending on the assumptions used. Some experts argue the probability of this name cluster is actually quite high, given how popular these names were. Furthermore, Christian tradition from the earliest centuries held that Jesus was buried initially in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, and that his body was not there after the third day. The idea of Jesus having a family tomb contradicts fundamental resurrection theology. For many believers, the Talpiot tomb identification is impossible to accept on theological grounds, regardless of the archaeological evidence. Yet the tomb exists, the ossuaries exist, the names are real. And the Judah son of Jesus inscription remains a historical puzzle regardless of whether this is Jesus of Nazareth's tomb. Other archaeological discoveries have provided context for understanding first-century Jewish life and early Christian practice, even if they don't provide direct evidence about Jesus' family. Excavations at Magdala, Mary Magdalene's hometown, have revealed a prosperous first-century town with a synagogue that Jesus might have visited. The site shows evidence of wealth and commercial activity, supporting the idea that Mary Magdalene could have been a woman of means who helped support Jesus' ministry. The town was destroyed by Roman forces in 67 CE during the First Jewish Revolt, which might explain why Mary Magdalene traditions became geographically dispersed. The people who remembered her were scattered. Papyrus fragments discovered in Egypt have preserved portions of non-canonical Gospels that we discussed earlier. These aren't theoretical texts. They're physical artifacts that researchers can hold, analyze, and date, using various scientific methods. The Gospel of Mary exists in 3 fragmentary manuscripts. The Gospel of Philip survives in the Nag Hammadi codices. These are real historical documents, even if their contents are controversial. In 2012, Harvard professor Karen King announced the discovery of a papyrus fragment she called the Gospel of Jesus' Wife. The fragment, written in Coptic, contained the phrase, "Jesus said to them, my wife." The announcement generated enormous media attention and scholarly debate. However, the authenticity of this fragment has been seriously challenged. Several experts have argued it's a modern forgery, pointing to suspicious aspects of the ink, the papyrus, and the grammar. While some researchers continue to defend its authenticity, the broader scholarly community has largely concluded it's not a genuine ancient text. This episode demonstrates both the intense interest in questions about Jesus' marital status and the importance of rigorous academic verification. We cannot simply accept sensational claims. We need careful analysis of the evidence. Archaeological evidence from early Christian sites shows diverse practices and beliefs. House churches from the 2nd and 3rd centuries show evidence of women in leadership roles. Inscriptions honor women as deacons and apostles. Artistic representations show women participating in ritual meals and teaching. This archaeological record confirms what the textual evidence suggested. Early Christianity was more diverse and egalitarian than later institutional forms. Women held positions of authority that would later be denied to them. But archaeology has inherent limitations. Material culture can tell us about practices and social structures, but it cannot directly answer questions about individual relationships. We won't find an ossuary inscribed, Mary Magdalene, wife of Jesus, because even if such a relationship existed, first-century burial practices wouldn't necessarily document it that way. What archaeology can do is provide context. It can show us that the world in which Jesus lived was one where marriage was normative, where women could have resources and agency, where diverse Christian communities preserved different traditions, and where institutional suppression of texts and traditions was a real historical phenomenon. Some researchers have pointed to ossuaries inscribed with women's names in family tombs, showing that women were buried with their families and their relationships documented. These practices make the absence of any mention of Jesus' marital status in early Christian texts more striking. Either he was unusual in being unmarried, or the marital relationship was so assumed it didn't require documentation, or later editors removed such references. Recent archaeological work in Jerusalem and Galilee continues to uncover first-century sites that help us understand Jesus' historical context better. Each discovery adds texture to our understanding. even if none provides the definitive smoking gun that would settle questions about Jesus' family life. The ground keeps its secrets carefully. 2,000 years of upheaval, Roman destruction, Byzantine construction, Crusader battles, Ottoman building, modern development have layered Jerusalem with complexity. What lies beneath remains largely inaccessible. What has been discovered is fragmentary and ambiguous. Yet these whispers from archaeology matter. They remind us that the questions we're asking are historical questions, not just theological ones. Jesus lived in a real place, at a real time, in a specific culture. Understanding that context is crucial for any honest investigation into what his life might have been like. The archaeological evidence doesn't prove Jesus had a family, but it certainly doesn't disprove it either. And it demonstrates conclusively that early Christianity was far more diverse than most people realize, with women playing crucial roles that were later systematically minimized. Now we arrive at what might be the most controversial aspect of our investigation, the possibility that Jesus had descendants and that certain families or groups have preserved knowledge of this lineage across 2 millennia. Before we explore this, we need to address something crucial. Does bloodline matter spiritually? For many Christians, the power of Jesus' message lies in his teachings, his sacrifice, and his spiritual significance, not in biological descent. Whether Jesus had children or didn't have children doesn't change the transformative power of the Sermon on the Mount or the radical compassion of the parables. In fact, one could argue that the obsession with bloodline contradicts Jesus' most fundamental teaching, that spiritual truth transcends biological inheritance. Jesus explicitly challenged the Jewish establishment's emphasis on Abrahamic descent, teaching instead that spiritual kinship was what mattered. You must be born again referred to spiritual rebirth, not physical lineage. So why does the lineage question persist? Why has it captured human imagination for centuries? Part of the answer lies in the human tendency to seek tangible connections to the sacred. Throughout history, people have treasured relics, physical objects that might have touched holy figures, hair, bones, clothing, even the wood of the cross. The desire for physical connection to the divine is deeply human. A bloodline would represent the ultimate relic, not an object that touched Jesus, but living human beings carrying his genetic material. In medieval Europe, royal families claimed descent from biblical figures to legitimize their rule. The idea of sacred bloodline merged political power with spiritual authority. The most famous articulation of the Jesus bloodline theory comes from medieval European legends about the Holy Grail. In some traditions, the Grail wasn't a cup at all. It was Sangreal on the Holy Grail, which some theorists reinterpret as Sangreal, royal blood. According to this interpretation, the Grail legend is actually coded language about Jesus' bloodline preserved in France. These theories became widely known through popular books and novels, particularly in the late 20th century. While these popular treatments often mix speculation with historical research in problematic ways, they did bring attention to genuine historical puzzles. Certain noble families in medieval France claimed descent from Jesus and Mary Magdalene. The Merovingian dynasty, which ruled parts of France from the 5th to 8th centuries, became central to these theories. Some medieval documents make cryptic references to the Merovingian sacred origin, though these are open to multiple interpretations. Were these claims based on actual preserved lineage, or were they political fabrications designed to legitimize power? Historical evidence is ambiguous at best. What we can say with more confidence is that communities in southern France preserved traditions about Mary Magdalene bringing something sacred to the region, whether that something was sacred knowledge, holy relics, or a child. The persistence of these traditions across centuries suggests they served an important function for the communities maintaining them. From a scientific standpoint, genetic testing of bloodline claims faces enormous challenges. 2,000 years represents approximately 80 generations. The genetic signal from any one ancestor becomes increasingly diluted with each generation. Millions of people today likely share some genetic material with anyone who lived in first-century Judea and had descendants that survived to the present. So even if Jesus had children, and even if their line survived, identifying specific descendants today would be scientifically problematic. We're not looking for a single family. We'd potentially be looking at millions of people who might share a tiny fraction of genetic material. But here's a more profound question. What would it mean theologically if Jesus had descendants? For some Christians, this possibility would be profoundly troubling. The traditional understanding of Jesus' nature, fully human and fully divine, celibate and set apart, is central to their faith. The idea of Jesus participating fully in human life, including sexuality and procreation, challenges this understanding. For other Christians, a fully human Jesus who experienced love, partnership, and family would make his teachings even more profound. It would mean he spoke about love from experience. It would mean his compassion came not from divine detachment, but from human understanding. It would mean his sacrifice was made by someone who had everything to lose, not just his life, but his family. Jewish theology has never had a problem with holy figures being married and having children. The great prophets and rabbis were married. Moses had children. Abraham had children. Their holy status wasn't diminished by their full participation in human life. The idea that celibacy makes someone more spiritual is actually not a Jewish concept. It entered Christianity through Greek philosophical influences. So from a Jewish theological perspective, Jesus being married with children would be entirely consistent with his role as a rabbi and teacher. It's only later Christian theology that required celibacy for maximum holiness. Some theological traditions have emphasized that Jesus had to experience everything human to fully redeem humanity. The letter to the Hebrews says, Jesus was tempted in every way, just as we are. Does every way include the temptations and challenges of intimate partnership and parenthood? It's a question theologians debate. The lineage theory ultimately asks us to consider, what was Jesus' mission? If his mission was to demonstrate divine power through miraculous separation from human limitation, then marriage and family would be incompatible with that mission. But if his mission was to show humans how to live spiritually while fully embracing human existence, then marriage and family would be entirely compatible. Where are you watching this from? I want to see how far across the world this conversation is reaching. Comment your city or country below. Let's map this global community of truth seekers together. The question of Jesus' lineage isn't just about history or genetics. It's about how we understand the relationship between the human and the divine, between flesh and spirit, between earthly life and spiritual truth. It's about whether we see the material world as something to transcend or something to sanctify through loving engagement. These are ancient questions, and different theological traditions answer them differently. What's important is recognizing that the questions themselves are legitimate, that people of deep faith can hold different views, and that seeking historical truth doesn't require abandoning spiritual truth. The Knights Templar have become legendary, surrounded by so much speculation and fiction that separating historical reality from fantasy is exceptionally difficult. But they do play a genuine historical role in the preservation and transmission of alternative Christian traditions, so we need to address them carefully. The Templars were founded around 1119 CE, ostensibly to protect Christian pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. They became extraordinarily wealthy and powerful, operating as international bankers and maintaining a military force. Their headquarters were on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, the site of the ancient Jewish temple. According to later legends, the Templars discovered something during their time in Jerusalem. Some stories say they found sacred texts. Others say they discovered the Ark of the Covenant or other holy relics. Some theories suggest they found documents related to Jesus' family or alternative gospels that contradicted church doctrine. What we know historically is that the Templars did develop heterodox beliefs that troubled the Catholic Church. When they were arrested en masse in 1307, on orders of King Philip IV of France and Pope Clement V, they were charged with heresy, including allegations of secret rituals and denial of Christ. Many of these charges were certainly fabricated, obtained through torture, and serving Philip's political goal of seizing Templar wealth. But some researchers suggest there might have been genuine theological divergence. The Templars had spent decades in the Middle East, interacting with Islamic, Jewish, and Eastern Christian traditions. They might have encountered alternative perspectives on Christian origins. The Templars operated extensively in southern France, the same region where Mary Magdalene traditions were preserved. Some researchers have noted that Templar churches and sites often featured unusual veneration of Mary Magdalene, more prominent than was typical in Catholic practice of the period. When the Templars were suppressed, stories emerged of survivors fleeing with treasures and secret documents. Some legends place these survivors in Scotland. Others suggest they integrated into other secret societies. Some theorists connect them to later esoteric groups like the Freemasons, though the evidence for such connections is highly controversial. The problem with Templar theories is that they've become a repository for every conspiracy theory about hidden Christian history. Almost any speculation about secret knowledge gets connected to the Templars, often without solid evidence. This doesn't mean the Templars didn't possess alternative knowledge. It means we must be extremely cautious about claims regarding what they knew. What we can say more confidently is that throughout medieval and early modern Europe, various groups and individuals preserved traditions that differed from Catholic orthodoxy. Some of these were mystical movements emphasizing direct spiritual experience. Some preserved alternative gospels and texts. Some maintained oral traditions from communities that predated Catholic doctrinal consolidation. The Cathars of southern France, whom we mentioned earlier, definitely held beliefs that contradicted church teaching. They were dualists who saw the material world as created by an evil deity and the spiritual world as the realm of the good God. They rejected many Catholic sacraments and church authority, and they venerated Mary Magdalene prominently. The Cathar connection to Mary Magdalene traditions is better documented than the Templar connection. When the Cathars were massacred during the Albigensian Crusade, 1209 to 1229, perhaps hundreds of thousands were killed. The brutality of this suppression demonstrates how seriously institutional Christianity took threats to its doctrinal monopoly. After the Cathars were destroyed, their specific teachings were largely lost. But the geographic region where they flourished, Languedoc in southern France, is the same region where Saralakali traditions persisted. This is unlikely to be coincidence. Different heterodox movements in the same region probably preserved and transmitted overlapping alternative traditions. Esoteric societies in the Renaissance and Enlightenment periods, Rosicrucians, Freemasons, various alchemical and mystical groups, often claimed to possess ancient secret knowledge. Some of their symbolism and ritual incorporated Magdalene veneration and references to sacred feminine wisdom. Whether this represented genuine preservation of ancient traditions or creative reinvention of romantic medieval legends is hotly debated. What matters for our investigation is recognizing a historical pattern. Groups that challenged Catholic authority often emphasized Mary Magdalene and preserved alternative narratives about Christian origins. The Church consistently suppressed these groups, often violently. Yet the traditions persisted, transmitted through underground networks, coded symbolism, and oral transmission. The most important thing to understand about secret societies is that secrecy was often necessary for survival. When expressing certain ideas could result in execution, people learned to communicate covertly. Symbols replaced explicit statements. Oral transmission replaced written documents that could be seized. Initiatory societies replaced public movements. So when we ask whether groups like the Templars possessed secret knowledge about Jesus' family, we're really asking, did communities that experienced persecution for heterodox beliefs preserve traditions about Christian origins that differed from official narratives? And the answer to that question is almost certainly yes, though determining exactly what knowledge was preserved and how accurate it was remains enormously difficult. Now we need to address the question that might be most important for many viewers. What would it mean for faith if Jesus had a wife and children? Does this possibility threaten Christian belief, or could it actually deepen spiritual understanding? Let me begin with this crucial point. Your faith is personal and sacred. No historical investigation can tell you what to believe spiritually. History tells us what probably happened in the past. Faith tells us what those events mean for our lives now. These are related but different questions. For some theological traditions, the idea of Jesus having a family is deeply problematic. These traditions emphasize Jesus' divine nature and see his celibacy as part of his set-apart status. In this view, Jesus' full participation in human life, including sexuality and procreation, would somehow diminish his divine nature or compromise his role as sacrificial savior. This perspective has deep roots in Christian history. Early Christian theologians, influenced by Greek philosophy, often saw the material world and bodily existence as inferior to spiritual reality. Celibacy was valued as a way of transcending bodily limitation and focusing entirely on spiritual matters. The requirement that Catholic priests remain celibate stems partly from this theological framework, the idea that someone fully dedicated to spiritual service should not be distracted by family obligations. If this applies to priests, the reasoning goes, it must certainly apply to Jesus himself. But here's what's important to recognize. This theological framework isn't the only Christian perspective, and it's not particularly Jewish in origin. Judaism, the tradition in which Jesus lived and taught, has always affirmed the goodness of creation, including bodily existence and sexuality within appropriate contexts. Jewish theology considers marriage and family to be blessings, not distractions from spiritual life. The great rabbis were married, the prophets were married. Their family lives didn't diminish their spiritual authority. If anything, their ability to speak about love and human relationship was enhanced by their lived experience. So from a Jewish theological perspective, Jesus being married would be entirely normal and wouldn't challenge his status as a great teacher and prophet. It's later Christian theology, influenced by Greek dualism, that created the expectation of celibacy. Many contemporary Christians have recovered a more incarnational theology, emphasizing that Jesus came to fully embrace human existence, not to transcend it. In this view, the incarnation means God entering completely into human life, experiencing everything that makes us human: joy and sorrow, connection and loss, love and grief. If Jesus never experienced intimate partnership, never held his own child, never knew the daily challenges and joys of family life, then in what sense did he fully experience human existence? How could he fully understand the human condition if he remained apart from one of its most universal experiences? The letter to the Hebrews says Jesus was tempted in every way, just as we are, yet he did not sin. Does this mean he experienced the full range of human temptation and challenge, including those related to intimate relationship? Different theologians answer differently. Some argue that Jesus' celibacy was part of his unique vocation, not a general template for holiness. Just as prophets might fast or practice other forms of asceticism for specific purposes, Jesus might have chosen celibacy for his particular mission, but this wouldn't make celibacy inherently superior to marriage. Others argue that Jesus' full humanity requires that he experience the full range of human relationship, including marriage and possibly parenthood. In this view, the tradition of Jesus' celibacy reflects later theological development rather than historical reality. What's crucial is recognizing that people of deep, sincere faith hold different positions on this question. It's not a matter of believers versus skeptics. It's a matter of different theological frameworks and different understandings of incarnation. Your faith doesn't depend on whether Jesus was married. The Sermon on the Mount is profound, whether Jesus delivered it as a celibate teacher or as a married one. The parables are transformative regardless of Jesus' marital status. The call to love your neighbor, to seek justice, to show mercy, these teachings have power independent of biographical details about Jesus' personal life. In fact, some Christians find that seeing Jesus as fully human, as someone who might have known romantic love and family bonds, makes his teachings about love even more meaningful. He spoke from experience, not divine abstraction. He understood from the inside what he was asking of his followers. The theological question isn't really about marriage. It's about how we understand the relationship between divine and human, between transcendence and immanence, between spiritual truth and embodied existence. Different Christian traditions have answered these questions differently throughout history, and that diversity reflects the richness of theological reflection. What matters most is this: seeking historical truth about Jesus doesn't require abandoning faith. Understanding the human context of his life doesn't diminish the spiritual power of his message. History and faith can coexist, each enriching the other. If there is truth to alternative narratives about Jesus' family, we must ask, why were these narratives suppressed? What was at stake? Who benefited from constructing a celibate, unattached Jesus, and what was lost in that construction? The answer has everything to do with power, authority, and control. In the first 3 centuries of Christianity, diverse communities competed for legitimacy. Some claimed authority through apostolic succession. They could trace their leadership back to the original disciples. Others claimed authority through possession of secret teachings Jesus had given to certain followers. Still others claimed authority through the immediate presence of the Holy Spirit in their communities. These different claims to authority produced different kinds of communities with different power structures. Apostolic succession privileged institutional hierarchy. Secret teachings privileged spiritual elites. Direct inspiration privileged charismatic leaders. As Christianity became increasingly institutionalized, particularly after Constantine's conversion, the apostolic succession model prevailed. This model required clear hierarchies, official doctrine, and controlled transmission of authority. Alternative models threatened this institutional structure. Now consider, if Jesus had a family, if Mary Magdalene was his wife and partner in ministry, if there were descendants carrying both his genetic line and his teachings, this would create an alternative source of authority that could challenge institutional hierarchies. Apostolic succession claimed authority flowed through Peter to the bishops of Rome. But what if authority could also flow through Mary Magdalene to her descendants or to communities preserving her teachings? What if the most intimate knowledge of Jesus resided not with male institutional leaders, but with a woman they had systematically excluded from authority? This would be profoundly threatening to a patriarchal institutional church. Throughout early Christian history, we see consistent patterns of marginalizing women's spiritual authority. Women who were prominent in the earliest communities, Mary Magdalene, Junia, called an apostle by Paul, Phoebe, a deacon, Priscilla, a teacher, were gradually written out or their roles diminished. The pastoral epistles, written later than Paul's authentic letters, include instructions limiting women's roles. I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man. She must be quiet. These instructions reflect institutional consolidation, not the earlier diversity where women clearly held leadership positions. The transformation of Mary Magdalene from apostle to repentant prostitute served multiple functions. It acknowledged her importance. You can't erase someone mentioned so prominently in the Gospels, while reframing her significance in ways that didn't threaten male authority. As a reformed sinner, she could be venerated without challenging the all-male apostolic succession. The suppression of texts portraying Mary Magdalene as a teacher and spiritual authority was part of this broader pattern. The Gospel of Mary, which shows her teaching the male disciples, was problematic precisely because it presented an alternative model of spiritual authority. Consider also the political dimensions. Roman emperors from Constantine onward saw Christianity as a potential unifying force for the empire. But unity required doctrinal consistency and institutional control. Diverse, autonomous Christian communities with different teachings and practices were politically inconvenient. Imperial authority partnered with ecclesiastical authority to suppress diversity and enforce orthodoxy. Alternative texts weren't just theologically problematic, they were politically dangerous because they suggested that Christian truth could exist outside institutional control. The requirement of clerical celibacy in the Western Church, formalized in later centuries, created a priesthood without family ties or inherited positions. This served institutional interests by preventing the development of hereditary clerical dynasties and by creating a class of religious professionals whose primary loyalty was to the institutional church rather than to family. But notice, this requirement explicitly separates clergy from one of the most fundamental human experiences. It creates a priesthood that cannot fully share in the family joys and struggles of the people they serve. If Jesus himself had a family, this separation would be harder to justify. Throughout history, groups that challenged Catholic authority often did so by appealing to alternative sources of spiritual knowledge. The Cathars, the Waldensians, various mystical movements. These groups claimed that truth could be accessed directly, without institutional mediation. They often gave prominent roles to women, and they were violently suppressed. The message was clear. The institution controls access to truth. Alternative narratives, alternative authorities, alternative practices will not be tolerated. Modern historical scholarship has increasingly recognized how much diversity existed in early Christianity and how that diversity was systematically erased. We're recovering texts, practices, and traditions that institutional Christianity tried to destroy. This recovery doesn't happen easily. It faces resistance from those invested in maintaining traditional narratives. What's remarkable is how much survived despite sustained efforts at suppression. Texts were buried in jars and survived in the Egyptian desert. Traditions were preserved by marginalized communities and transmitted orally across generations. Alternative narratives persisted in legends, symbols, and heterodox movements. Truth, it turns out, is remarkably resilient. You can burn books, execute heretics, and declare orthodoxy, but you cannot completely erase memory. Something always survives. The suppression of alternative narratives about Jesus' life wasn't primarily about protecting spiritual truth. It was about controlling institutional power. It was about determining who could speak with authority about God, who could interpret Scripture, who could lead communities. And in that struggle for control, women's voices were silenced. Diverse traditions were erased, and a more complex, more human Jesus was replaced with a figure who could better serve institutional needs. Understanding this history doesn't require cynicism about faith, but it does require honesty about how institutions function, how power operates, and how narratives are constructed and controlled. We've traveled together through 2,000 years of history, examining texts that were suppressed, traditions that were marginalized, and questions that were forbidden. We've looked at manuscript evidence, archaeological discoveries, medieval legends, and theological implications. What have we found? We found that early Christianity was far more diverse than most people realize. We found that women, particularly Mary Magdalene, played crucial roles that were later systematically minimized. We found that texts preserving alternative traditions about Jesus and his closest followers were branded heretical and suppressed. We found that communities across centuries maintained memories that differed from institutional narratives. Have we proven that Jesus had a wife and children? No. The historical evidence is suggestive, but not conclusive. We have traditions, hints, fragments, and suggestive silences, but not definitive proof. But here's what we have proven. The question is legitimate. It's not blasphemous to ask. It's not faithless to investigate. And the fact that the question has been so aggressively suppressed throughout history suggests it touched something important. More significantly, we've seen that understanding Jesus as a fully human being, someone who might have experienced the full range of human relationships, doesn't diminish his spiritual significance. If anything, it makes his teachings about love, compassion, and justice even more profound because they would come from lived experience. Your faith is your own. No historical investigation can tell you what to believe spiritually. If you find meaning, comfort, and transformation in traditional Christian teaching, that's sacred and valid. If you're drawn to alternative understandings that emphasize Jesus' full humanity, that's also valid. What matters is honest seeking. What matters is being willing to ask difficult questions and follow evidence wherever it leads. What matters is recognizing that institutional narratives are not the same as historical truth, and that recovering suppressed voices and marginalized traditions enriches our understanding. The communities that preserved Saralakali traditions across centuries, the scribes who buried manuscripts in Egyptian caves, the medieval dissidents who risked their lives maintaining alternative beliefs, they all understood something crucial. Truth matters. Memory matters. The full story matters, even when it's dangerous to tell it. You're part of this recovery. By watching this video, by engaging with these questions, by being willing to think critically about narratives you were taught, you're participating in something larger than yourself. You're part of a global community of truth seekers who refuse to accept that important questions are forbidden. This investigation doesn't end here. There are more texts to examine, more traditions to explore, more questions to ask. The suppressed voices of early Christianity are still being recovered. New manuscript discoveries still occur. Scholarly understanding continues to evolve. This is just one chapter in a much larger story. Subscribe to this channel to continue uncovering what history tried to bury. Join a community that values honest inquiry over comfortable certainty, that embraces complexity over simplistic narratives, that recognizes that seeking truth is itself a spiritual practice. The journey into hidden history continues. There are more revelations waiting, more suppressed traditions to explore, more questions that deserve honest investigation. Click on the next video that appears on your screen, because the conversation we've started today is too important to end here. Your voice matters in this recovery. Your questions matter. Your willingness to engage with complexity matters. Together, We're reclaiming histories that were hidden, amplifying voices that were silenced, and asking questions that were forbidden. The truth has survived 2 millennia of suppression. It's still here, waiting to be fully discovered, and you're part of that discovery. Thank you for watching until the end. See you in the next video.